Hello, everyone. My name is Foster Chamberlin, and I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Give me this chance to talk about my new book, Uncivil Guard, Policing Military Culture and the Coming of the Spanish Civil War. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and share my screen with you. I got a little PowerPoint to go along with this. And before I do anything else, what I really want to do is thank Louisiana State University Press for this opportunity, and a special thanks to Corey Calabria from their social media team for giving me this opportunity. So what I'm going to do is talk for about 25 minutes here, and then we'll have plenty of time for your questions. And so I'm looking forward to that. So first of all, just a little bit about myself. I received my PhD in modern European history from UC San Diego in 2017. And then I taught for a total of 5 years in Turkey at Boğaziçi and Bilkent universities before taking my current position as an assistant teaching professor in modern European history here at Northern Arizona University. And in addition to this book, I've published in several journals, including Ayer, War and Society, European History Quarterly, and the Bulletin for Spanish and Portuguese Historical Societies. So if you're interested in any of my other work, you can check out those journals. And I've also received fellowships from the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the Fulbright Foundation, and the Spanish government's Hispanex program. And those all help support the research that I did for this book. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention that I am also the founder and co-host of the Historias podcast that features interviews with various scholars on new subjects in Spanish and Iberian history. And we try to put out an episode every month. So if you're interested, you can go to historiaspodcast.org, or you can just search Historias Spanish History Podcast on the app that you use for your podcasts and check that out as well. So now let's turn to the book itself, and I wanted to start by giving you a little bit of backstory about how this all came to being. It's a book that's at least 12 years in the making, perhaps more, because as I was starting my PhD at UCSD back in 2010, I was interested in the causes of the Spanish Civil War during the Second Republic period. So that would be the years 1931 to 1936, just prior to the Civil War. And political violence is really thought to be one of, if not the most important factor in terms of those um, causes. And so as I was reading more about that, I kept coming across this organization, the Civil Guard, and yet it seemed like no one was studying that organization in particular. And so that's why I wanted to learn more. And so perhaps I should say that the Civil Guard is Spain's largest police force and has been for only over 150 years. It's a gendarmerie, so it's a militarized police force that specializes in rural policing. So, as it turned out, that there actually was in English another dissertation on the Civil Guard in this period by a British scholar, Gerald Blaney Jr. But he really focused on why is it that most civil guards stayed loyal and acquiesced, if not supported, the Republic when it began in 1931. And yet it seems that the majority of them turned against the Republic when the Civil War broke out in 1936. Um, and so I was more interested, though, in that question of political violence and what the Guard's role was in that respect. So in 2013-14, I went to Spain for my research year, and that's when I had that Fulbright fellowship. And so my advisor in Spain during that time was Eduardo González Calleja of the Universidad Carlos III. And he gave me early access to a book he published the next year called Cifras Cuentas, in which he cataloged every instance of political violence during the Second Republic. And what he found is that the Civil Guard was actually the most violent organization in the country during that time. So that really kind of gave me focus for the project. That became my research question, essentially, is why was that? And so I knew that I needed to do a deep dive into the organizational culture of this institution in order to answer that question. And I also decided that I wanted to look at particular instances of political violence involving the Civil Guard. Take a look at the most prominent ones. There would be the most sources on those to really get a sense of how it was that these confrontations could spill over into violence in particular cases. So I just wanted to mention some of the archives that were really helpful to me in my work. First of all, you had the Archivo Histórico Nacional, which has all kinds of things, but among them are the telegrams that were sent to the Ministry of the Interior. And actually, a lot of these telegrams concern the Civil Guard. Many towns all around the country complaining about their civil guards, basically. And so that really gave me a window into public perceptions of the institution, and I was able to kind of track the patterns of these complaints. Also important were the Archivo General Militar de Segovia and the Archivo de la Guardia Civil. These two archives house the personnel service records for both officers and enlisted men. And so I wound up viewing a couple hundred of those, and those really allowed me to identify patterns as well. But in this case, of what the lifestyle of these civil guards was and the patterns of their service. And then finally, the Hemeroteca Municipal de Madrid, which is Madrid's newspaper archive, one of the best in the country. And so that really gave me kind of the media response in the newspapers to what the Civil Guard was doing in this period. So as I was going through all of these materials, I quickly realized that honor was a really central feature of the organizational culture of the Civil Guard. And that is something that is a value that was essential going all the way back to the founding of the institution in the mid-19th century. But you also see a tremendous continuity there where those basic regulations of the Civil Guard really didn't change. And so I developed an argument that um, that rigidity became a problem for the Civil Guard by the time they got to the Second Republic, because they looked for that respect from the public. And when they didn't get it, in the protests of the period, then they would also often use violence to impose that upon the population. And in fact, if you look at their regulations, even a verbal insult can be considered justification for using violence against the crowd. So that was kind of the argument in my dissertation. But then when I defended that, my committee said, "Okay, but is it really just about honor, or should you really focus on this idea of organizational culture more broadly? There must be other aspects of it as well." And they also said you could broaden the scope somewhat. It doesn't just have to be about the Second Republic. And so when I was at Bilkent University, I had the chance to work on turning that work into the book that you see now. And so those are some of the things that I set out to do. I added several chapters that did broaden the scope. One chapter looking all the way back to the foundation of the Civil Guard in 1844, and then an earlier example. I'll say more about that in a minute. And then a final chapter taking the story up to the beginnings of the Civil War as well. In addition, I really looked more into the literature, conceptually speaking, about organizational culture and tried to really frame the book around that. And so organizational culture is an idea that actually started in the business world. And it's really just about looking at the unwritten assumptions and default practices that are kind of built into the mindset of people within that organization and that shape the way that they behave and respond to events, particularly in times of crisis where there may not be any kind of strict written protocol about how to deal with these situations. Now, of course, within that broad framework of organizational culture, you have many different types. And so what I realized is I'd really have to draw on the literature from both military and police culture, because being this militarized institution that was doing civilian policing, both were relevant to the Civil Guard. So military culture is all about those unwritten assumptions within a military organization that shape the way they act in wartime. And so this is where I was able to bring in some of those other aspects of the Civil Guard's culture. Discipline, sacrifice, loyalty, for example, they were all very important for Civil Guards as well. But usually they're not fighting in wartime, rather they're conducting these everyday policing activities. So that's where the idea of police culture really came in as well. And a lot of the work that was done in this respect, and police culture is essentially the same idea, those unwritten practices that shape the way that police conduct their everyday policing. A lot of that work was done by sociologists in the US in the mid-20th century. But I found that a lot of the patterns they identified apply very well to the Civil Guard. The big theme here is isolation. If you get pulled over by the police, you're not too happy about it. And so there is this kind of disconnect with the public. The flip side of that is solidarity. That since policemen do have a hard time kind of connecting with the public, they connect very well with each other and develop very strong bonds there. And so you get this us versus them mentality developing in a lot of police organizations. And I think that is exactly what you see in the case of the Civil Guard. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is just give you a brief overview of the chapters in the book, just so you get a sense of what's in it. But before I do that, I just also wanted to mention, why did I title the book Uncivil Guard? Well, I was hoping that it would have kind of two meanings. On the one hand, indicating the term Civil Guard indicates that it's a civilian institution, but it's actually not. It has a military structure, and that's important for my overall argument, right? But then also, the name suggests that they're supposed to keep the peace, maintain order in society, and indeed, that is the mission of any policing organization. But what I'm arguing here is that in the Second Republic, uh, that didn't happen. That actually the Civil Guard became one of the instigators of violence, further destabilizing the country, and ultimately giving the generals who rebelled against the Republic in 1936, starting the Civil War, their primary excuse for doing so. That the country was in a state of disorder. They were going to bring back order to the country, but what's always been ironic to me is that it was the country's own police organizations, in large part, that were the ones that were actually perpetrating this violence. And so that's what I really wanted to emphasize. And then we chose those colors of yellow and red for the cover as well. Not only are they the colors of Spain, but we thought they really captured the violent atmosphere of that period. And then finally, the cover image is of prisoner transport after the rebellion of October 1934, which is kind of a center point for the book. I'll talk about in a minute. And so this is an image where you can actually see the civil guards interacting with the public. And so that's why we really like that for the cover. Okay, so turning now to the chapters of the book. So in the first chapter, I go all the way back to the founding of the institution in 1844 to look at what the origins of its organizational culture actually were. This is why it gets the name Civil Guard, because there was a debate among the liberal factions at the time about whether it should be a civilian or a military institution. But that military view wound up winning out. Um, in addition, the guy you see here is the Duque de Almada. He's really considered to be the founder of the institution, the first director general. And so he was very important for shaping its culture, its founding regulations, which, as I mentioned, never really changed. Um, and so he really drew on his aristocratic background in terms of determining what those values of the civil guard should be. And that's where you see honor taking such an important role. Now, the second chapter kind of stands outside of the chronology of the book, but looks at the everyday policing that civil guards were doing on a daily basis, interacting with the public in these small towns. And what I found is that theme of isolation that's so important for so many police organizations. It's even more so for the Civil Guard because that's something that Almada actually wanted for their organization. To isolate them from the public so that they would be immune to corruption or political favoritism. And so they lived in these casas cuarteles, these barracks that also served as a police station on the outskirts of town. But I also argue that it was impossible for them to be completely isolated from the pueblo, the people of the town. And so they forged these informal alliances with the elites of the town in particular. But of course, that would cause resentment among working class people who weren't members of that elite. Now, in the third chapter, I turn to the first case study, and this one is about a series of anarchist bombings that occurred in Barcelona in the 1890s, and the Civil Guard was brought in to try and find the perpetrators. But they didn't really have any training in investigative policing or detective work, which was just in its infancy at that time. And so they drew on their past strategies of mass arrests and then torture to try and win confessions. And they had previously done this in several cases in rural areas without too much blowback. But now that they're doing it in an urban area and arresting some prominent writers and so forth, their work there becomes an international scandal. And so this chapter is all about what the origins of that enmity between working class people and the Civil Guard are. And I think you can find a lot of it in this incident during the 1890s, during the Restoration period in Spain. The fourth chapter turns to the training of the generation of civil guards that would serve during the Second Republic. So I'm looking from about 1880 to 1920. And what I found is that essentially there is no training like an academy specifically for the Civil Guard. What they have is military service that almost all guards do before joining the Civil Guard itself. And so I look at the training that the officers received in the infantry academy in particular, as well as the service of so many guards in the colonial wars in Morocco prior to joining the Civil Guard. And then the training that they do receive is a 6 months apprenticeship period in the Civil Guard itself. And so I argue that that period was very important for inculcating them in this organizational culture, but also kind of a missed opportunity on the part of the government that this was an entirely informal training, just by the immediate superiors. And there was no effort to kind of shape that training or adapt it to the Republic. So in chapter 5, we come to the Republic itself. And in this chapter, I look at kind of the political landscape, the different political players, and how they related to the Civil Guard. And so the Republican parties, they were critical of the Civil Guard prior to this point, but they never wound up reforming it, not in a substantial way anyway, because they realized that it was just so important for the stability of this new regime that they weren't willing to touch it. Meanwhile, you had the socialists. They were even more critical of the Civil Guard, even wanting to dissolve it, but they were unable to convince the government to institute those reforms. Not only that, but that criticism further alienated the civil guards from them. Finally, you have conservatives. These were folks who knew the language of the civil guard, knew how to appeal to their desire for respect from the public, for instance. And so, even though civil guards were supposed to be politically neutral, you increasingly see them favoring the conservatives more openly, especially right near the end of the Republic. And I'll mention these two characters on the screen here in just a second. So now the second half of the book turns to these case studies of particular incidents of political violence during the Second Republic concerning the Civil Guard. And so here is the map that is in the book that I think the Mary Eggert was the designer, I think did a good job with. And so the first incident I'm going to talk about is Castilblanco in the Extremadura region in the west. Then we'll go to Arnedo in La Rioja, and we'll talk about the Asturias Rebellion in the north there. And then I'll finally say a little bit about Andalusia there, south. So Castilblanco, it's actually the last day of 1931, is unusual because this is an incident where a town kills their four civil guards. Usually it was the reverse, and the civil guards were the ones doing the killing. But I look at how the civil guards culture, and in particular their strict enforcement of the law, may have earned resentment in the town that may have predisposed the townspeople to kind of turn violently against the civil guards during a protest. But then with all these incidents, I also look at the national repercussions as well. And Jose Sanjurjo, he's the guy who you see here, who was the director general at the time. Um, he really wasn't upset so much about the death of the guards. You know, that's the dangers of the job, but the insult to their honor. So you can really see it, the rhetoric put in those terms. Whereas Margarita Nelken, a prominent socialist who you see here, she continued to criticize the civil guard, even though they had been killed in this incident. And so again, you see that enmity increasing through that. Now, in the Arnedo incident, which occurred just a week later, this time it's civil guards doing the killing. They kill 11 people during a protest in this small city. And so again, I look at how the rhetoric of the protesters, including criticism of the civil guard, may have predisposed them to open fire during this protest. And again, I look at their response. And here you see Sanjurjo trying to excuse the civil guards for their actions. He winds up getting dismissed from his post for that, and then is so resentful of that he helps to launch a coup against the government in August of 1932. And so you can see how these incidents of violence have real political repercussions. Now, the next one is the socialist-led rebellion of October 1934 against the conservative Republican government at the time. And so this is kind of the biggest event of the Republic prior to the Civil War. So that's why I have two chapters about this one. The rebellion was primarily among miners in the Asturias region, and the civil guard posts in their towns were the first target. So you see a total of 111 civil guards being killed during this rebellion. And so the first chapter that deals with this focuses on the rebellion itself and the patterns of how these posts were attacked. Um, Guards fought back in almost every instance, but after this almost choreographed battle, they would surrender, being severely outnumbered. But after the rebellion, there were several court-martials that found civil guards guilty of not defending their posts enough. And so I think it really set a precedent of this armed struggle against the working class that you really didn't see to the same extent prior to this. The next chapter looks at the repression of the rebellion, which was also led by the Civil Guard. Um, and the major in charge and his men, Lisardo Doval, they wound up torturing 10,000 people during this um, during this repression. And so I compare that with that earlier example of Barcelona in the 1890s that I mentioned before, and argued that now the purpose is no longer investigation, but rather it's revenge, because civil guards feel that they've been attacked by the working class of Spain, and so that's what they want to take a revenge on. And so I think October 1934 is a real turning point where um, you see this kind of what was before a tension between the working classes and the civil guard, now being this open hostility on both sides. And you can really see what I mean by that. This is why I wanted to have this last chapter about the beginnings of the Civil War, focusing on southern Spain, Andalusia, because probably the majority of guards did join the rebellion. And then what I look at is how they really became leaders from the first days of the rebellion of the repression on the Francoist side. Um, and they were leaders not only because they were an organized force that knew these local towns, but also because now it seemed justified that violence against these working class leaders that 5 years ago in 1931 would have been unthinkable for the Civil Guard. And so it's that change in their approach over the course of the Republic that's something that I really try and trace throughout the book as well. All right, so I want to thank you once again for coming and for your interest in the book. And now I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so much for that, Foster. That was a great presentation, and we're really excited about your book. And I also want to thank everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Rashed Chowdhury, from tuning in from Toronto, Michael Friedman from Pittsburgh, and Colin Mackinson from New Orleans. We appreciate you spending this afternoon with us and learning more about this book. Um, I'm gonna start with a couple questions from the audience, and I just want to remind everyone that if you do have any questions, just put them in the chat, and I'll make sure to let Foster know. So I'm going to start with a question from Ellen Chamberlin, and asks, "Do you think this culture still exists in the Civil Guard today, or has it changed significantly?"
Mhm. Yeah, well, I didn't study the Civil Guard today, but I can make a few general remarks. And it's been interesting for me because I've been to their headquarters, for instance, many times over the course of doing this research. Um, what I would say is that overall, the culture of the Civil Guard has changed a lot. Because you have to remember, I mean, during the Franco period, you essentially had an entrenchment of things I was talking about, especially at the very end of the book, where the sort of standard talking points of the Franco regime, you'll see those reflected in the literature of the Civil Guard. But then, of course, starting in 1975, Spain makes a transition to democracy. And so the Civil Guard had to make that transition as well. They were, and it wasn't an easy one. You know, there were debates about whether the institution should be dissolved or should be made civilian in that period. And there were also guards who opposed these changes, and they were some of the ones most involved in the attempted coup against the democracy in the 1980s. But I think we have to remember that that was a minority of the guards. And over time, I think they were successful in changing their culture so that now they are really thought to be a fundamental part of the structures of a democratic Spain. And again, they're still the number one police force in the country, along with the Policía Nacional. However, of course, there are still sort of hints of the old ways that we can sometimes see. Occasional controversies, such as a few years ago when some civil guards there were some immigrants who were trying to cross into one of the enclaves in Africa through the water, and so civil guards fired rubber bullets into the water, and about a dozen of those people wound up dying. Um, so there are things like that, and also just as another example, now I haven't been there for a few years, but at the last time I was there, there's still a couple busts of Francisco Franco that you can find in the Civil Guard Museum is another example. So you can discover some of these things. But I think even the fact that you occasionally have an incident of violence involving the Civil Guard, and that'll really make the news. That's a big change from the Second Republic or the Franco period where it would be multiple of these incidents per year. So that tells you a lot right there.
Thanks for that answer.
Hmm.
We have a great question from Colin, but actually, I first want to ask you something that I've been thinking about because I feel like it's in conversation with what you
Hmm.
were just saying. As we know, like history, right, is like, like a collection of stories that changes, and I'm just kind of curious about the legacy of the Civil Guard. Is it pretty fixed now how we think about it? Like how did it kind of come about, like how we think about this? Does that
Hmm.
make sense?
Yeah, well, I think it makes sense, especially in the Spanish case, because I think of most Americans probably never even heard of the Civil Guard, but in Spain, everyone knows it because, like I said, it's still very much present in a big police force. And what I found just to talking to people is that people's reactions will still be quite polarized. Where if you talk to someone who's perhaps a little more on the left of politics, they'll often have some not so nice things to say about it. If you talk to someone who's a little more on the right, then they often will have nice things to say about it, or perhaps have a relative who's a civil guard. And so I think that yeah, as the country started to transition towards democracy, that there was kind of a big PR effort on the part of the civil guard. Um, to kind of leave those old impressions behind and to really be thought of as a democratic police force. And like I said, I think they have been largely successful, but those resentments are still there in the society to be sure.
This is Colin's question. Colin asks, were the assault guards members of the Guardia Civil or were they a separate entity?
Oh, thank you. Yes, that's something that I discuss a bit in the book, but I didn't have time to do it here, so I'm glad to have a chance to do that. So no, the civil guards, sorry, the assault guards were not part of the civil guard, but rather they were the full name is actually the Sección de Asalto del Cuerpo de Seguridad. So you have the smaller urban police force, the Cuerpo de Seguridad or Security Corps. And then within that, the guard is a special section that is concerned with, it's like a rapid response force for urban areas, and it's an anti-disturbance force. And so the idea was several things with that force, but one is that it would be a force that's particularly loyal to the Republic because it's created during the Republic, and it would be one that was civilian in its nature. But everyone in the assault guard was drawn from the army. And very quickly, they started wearing, military style uniforms. They started carrying long rifles. And so what I argue is that the Republic failed with the Assault Guard to create a force that was really distinct in its culture from the Civil Guard. And so you actually see them also perpetrating instances of violence. And in particular, and another thing I argue in the book is that there were calls in the Civil Guard's own professional journal, the Revista Técnica de la Guardia Civil, for practical changes, like going from pistols or batons instead of carrying long rifles, starting to use non-lethal crowd control techniques like tear gas. And yet the Republican authorities ignored those suggestions and instead trying to concentrate their efforts on this new force, the assault guard. If some of those reforms had been implemented again in the much larger civil guard, it might have made a difference.
That makes me think of a question that I'd like to ask you, which is kind of about patterns. I'm just curious if there's any patterns that you've noticed in your research, like how it basically when it comes to like the balance between like military, government, civilians, or maybe how a law enforcement unit can become more militarized, as in the case of the Civil Guard.
Mhm. Yeah, well, the interesting thing about the Civil Guard is that it was actually militarized from the beginning, but in the early days, it wasn't actually part of the army. But you're going to see it becoming more so, so that during the Restoration regime, which was a conservative liberal regime, very concerned about security, it did actually become part of the overall structure of the army. And the Director General of Civil Guard is always an army general. And so that's why I wanted to talk about Barcelona in the 1890s, because it's during that period that you see it deployed a lot more for these public order um, incidents, which wasn't really what it was originally meant for, although it was actually used for that from the very beginning. Then the other big turning point, I think, is October 1934, because after that, in that professional journal, they're not talking about, how can we go to more non-lethal policing, et cetera, anymore. But instead, they're talking about how can we get fortified bases? How can we get rapid response teams armed with machine guns and mortars, things like that? And so it becomes a much more militarized, kind of confrontational situation with the public.
So you recently did an AMA or Ask Me Anything with a really popular subreddit called r Ask Historians. I just wanted to ask you, what was that like?
Oh, that was a great experience. Yeah, that was my first time doing something like that, and um, I was a little nervous because, sometimes Reddit has a reputation that you can get some people saying some pretty wild things on there. But I wound up getting about a dozen questions, and I thought that they were all really good. That not only focused on the material that I said you can ask me about, but really engaging with that in a very thoughtful way. So I had a lot of fun responding to those questions.
Yeah, I can't imagine kind of, like having to, access all that information that quickly, like it's like are you just have do you have books near you and you're just sort of like double checking things? It seems like a really interesting process.
Yeah, I looked up, I had to double check a few things, and that's always something I get a little nervous about, but before I do things like this. But then what I've come to realize is that after having worked on the project for so long, I know it pretty well. It's much more often that I have a student ask me a question in one of my survey classes where I'll just have to say I don't know the answer. But usually I'll have at least something to say at this point if it concerns the Civil Guard and the Second Republic.
I'm curious about kind of like civilians, all the kind of the volunteers who volunteered for the Civil War.
hmm
Because as we know, there were a lot of civilian volunteers who fought for the Republic, but also the other side as well.
hmm
So, I mean, obviously, most famously, George Orwell, who fought with the anti-Stalinist militia, if I'm right,
Yeah.
and later wrote about his experiences in Homage to Catalonia. I'm curious about messaging. Like, what messages were these people getting? How did these messages leave Spain? And I'm also curious why this conflict was such a rallying point for, wherever you were on the spectrum, unless this is kind of overblown, if that makes sense.
hmm No, I mean, I think that you have a good point there that the volunteers on the Republican side get all of the attention. But there were volunteers on the nationalist or Francoist side as well. concerning the Civil Guard in particular, the story is a little different because it's a professional police force. So it is a volunteer only force, but typically you have to have served in the army first. So one of the things I look at what was interesting to me is that most of the enlisted guards are from peasant backgrounds. And so how do they wind up having such a confrontational relationship with people from the same backgrounds where they are? And so that's where I think that culture becomes so important, as well as that isolation. So even if they started from very similar origins, they actually become isolated from those origins once they join the Civil Guard. And so, like I said, it's hard to know the exact number, but it seems like over half the civil guards did join the rebellion when the Civil War broke out. But they certainly weren't the only ones. In particular for the nationalists, you have Falanges, basically fascist militias, and then also Carlist militias. That's the traditionalist party. I think that if you kind of combine those three, so the Civil Guard, the Carlists, and the Phalanges together, those were primarily the ones who were doing the behind the lines cleansing, so to speak. And in many cases, these kind of ad hoc units were led by civil guards because they were the professionals, and they knew how to do this. And so that's why I think that they played such an important role because on both sides of the conflict, you have these militias who are very, very willing to carry out this very bloody repression. But the nationalists had the advantage of these civil guards that could lead these things in a professional way, which the Republicans didn't, at least not to the same extent.
It's interesting to me, from what you write in the book, like the Civil Guard doesn't necessarily have much training, if I'm getting that right, in the beginning.
Yeah, well, not specific to being a civil guard anyway. Aside from that 6 months apprenticeship period, that's really all they get.
It's just kind of interesting. We just have this really compressed period where you have, all of a sudden, like people, Civil Guard members kind of being in charge of militias, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, well, and let me just add that what was interesting to me is that that was kind of completely against one of the primary components of their culture, which is political neutrality. And that seems to be something that they took pretty seriously throughout their history. And in fact, it was illegal for them to join a political party. But especially as you go into the first months of 1936, you start seeing more and more of them violating that and working together with the Phalangists in particular. And so I think that the tensions had just gotten so high that they kind of dropped that political neutrality. Not all of them, but a lot of them dropped the political neutrality idea because they thought that for one thing, in many cases, it was just about saving their lives. They really did fear that a communist revolution was imminent, but also they felt that their institution was being disrespected. They were afraid that even the civil guard would be uh, dissolved. And then finally, this general sense of disorder occurring in the country. That the country itself might fall apart, and so then they felt that there was this higher duty for them to join this rebellion, which they believed was going to restore that order to Spain.
That's a fascinating answer. So I'm actually really glad that I asked. I have a question from Rashed. I'm going to ask a couple more. Now's the time. If you have anything left to ask Foster, please put it in the chat. So the question from Rashed is, at what point in your life did you learn Spanish, and what was the process like? And were any of the documents that you used linguistically challenging?
Oh, great question. Yeah, thank you. Well, it's kind of a funny story. If you go all the way back to middle school, I took French. I was really bad at it. So then my parents said, "Why don't you try Spanish instead?" And so that's how I actually got started. And I in high school, but then when I was an undergrad at the University of Michigan, I did an intensive program with their residential college, and that's more when I really started to learn it. And then I studied abroad in Spain, but and then I had that research year later on. But I think I felt like it wasn't until I came back a couple of summers after that for more research. And at that point, most of my American friends had left, and so I just had Spanish friends. And so then I really had to speak Spanish, and it wasn't until that point where I felt that I could really say I was fluent. Now, in terms of the documents, I think I got the nice thing about Spanish is that what I find is as you get to the more sort of academic subjects, history and so forth, it actually gets easier because there's so many cognates with English. But certainly there were certain things that were challenging. I mean, I had to learn a lot of the military terminology. Some of the documents were handwritten, and that was certainly a challenge to read the a lot of the letters would just look the same in the cursive that they used. Um, but another challenge that I faced is that I'm looking at a lot of legal documentation. And of course, I'm no expert in the Spanish legal system. I'm still not, but over time, I was able to kind of piece together enough of how the system worked so that I felt I could speak to that because, yeah, and in fact, well, I shortened some of these, not to bore everyone, but at least to some extent, I actually look at some of these court martials involving the Civil Guard, because anytime a case involves the Civil Guard, even if it's with a civilian, it always goes to a court martial. That's another aspect of that military structure. And so that was kind of aspect. So yeah, it was not only the Spanish legal system, but also the military legal system that I really had to familiarize myself with for this work.
Thank you for that answer, and thanks for that great question, Rashid. We are reaching that time where near the end of our Q&A. I'm going to ask you one more question. This is our traditional last question that we ask authors before we sign off. And that is, what are you working on now that this book is out in the world? Like, what's next?
Yeah, well, I've got two things at the moment. One is kind of a extension because I went back to Spain and France to work on that chapter about Barcelona in the 1890s. So I'm working on an article using some of that research that didn't make it into the book, specifically comparing the French and Spanish policing at that time because France also had several terrorist attacks in that period. And yet, this cycle of violence involving torture and so on that occurred in Spain didn't occur in France. So what did this French police do differently? That's one project. That's a small project I'm working on. And then in terms of the larger second project, I'm really interested in pursuing this idea of military culture further. But beyond just the Civil Guard, this time looking at the Spanish military more broadly. And one of the things that really strikes me is just this brutalization of warfare as you go into the 20th century, whether you look at the Germans in Southwest Africa, and then obviously the First and Second World Wars, or the Spanish Civil War is another example. My suspicion is that some of those practices of warfare, many of which had their origins in the colonies, some of them had their origins in the Spanish colonies, in particular, and especially the Cuban War of Independence. And so I'm inspired by people like Isabel Hull, who worked on Southwest Africa. Jeffrey Jensen worked on military culture in the Spanish military, and John Lawrence Tone worked on that brutal warfare in Cuba. But I'm interested in investigating that further, seeing to what extent Spanish military culture had to do with that brutality, and also with how some of those practices that emerged in places like Cuba then became part of European practices of warfare more generally.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, the link between colonialism and just kind of general military practice. We can't wait to see more from you, and we really appreciate you being with us today. I also want to thank once more time, everyone in the audience for tuning in. I really appreciate your time. We're going to sign off, but before we do, is there anything else you'd like to say, Foster?
Yeah, I also want to thank everybody once again for your interest in the book. I really appreciate that. And once again, to thank LSU Press and especially you, Corey, for putting this on and hosting. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks again, everyone. Until next time.